Not
It's a
personally,
big
no.
place.
But he's the
He's
Bible
a
project.
laureate, right?
He's my good friend. He's actually my co-founder of the foundation. So it's the foundation for some big science and AI research. So SIP. Yes.
I'm gonna look at that one.
Well, it's a nice thing.
I'll send it to you.
Yeah.
I'll send it to you actually. I'll send it to you, and I'll forward it to you. I'll forward it to both of you. So this is something I've heard.
hbrady@berkeley.edu.
Okay. Wait. Let me do this.
H,
Actually, I'll
like
just
Brady,
type
the Brady bunch.
and type out your email. So I send it to you right now.
Hi, I'm Siona. Siona.
I'll send it to you.
And I'll put
Actually,
voice in
a
it.
friend
Yes,
told me
please.
to get that
And I'll send you to the. So we've done something that has taken Anthropic 5 years to do. We did it in 2 months. So Anthropic, meaning that on the social media, specifically on social media. Anthropic, social media, they took 5 years to code what we are today. After 2 months. Which is, guess how many social media files they have on YouTube?
I don't even want to guess. Go ahead.
Just one.
Million.
Million, very good. What do you think? He said million. What do you think?
Million
More
more.
than a million? Or a
More
million?
than a
Less
million.
than
I would go for more than a million.
half a million. So we did it in 2 months.
Yeah.
Half a million. So I'm the second one.
Great, thank you.
Seriously. And I'll just send it to you.
Sorry, we haven't printed that out yet.
But it's nice to have you done this from time to time. Yeah, super excited about your projects now.
Right now, but yeah.
I was chatting with one of the students from Change Maker. I feel like they were very
And we booked like 100 seat rooms to really try to like fill that space. Yeah.
but they do a lot of this is going to be very tough.
Oh yeah, I took a test and we'll leave you at prep. Yeah, he did like maths 1 to 10.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
Yeah,
Doing well. I passed my quals on Friday, so I'm excited.
awesome. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, and I guess we don't go to defense, so the calls we don't have to wait and so you're closest thing for defense in a way. So I like did all my work and got feedback on my dissertation sufficient and all that. But positive feedback, so. It was the last year I was like, okay, well I'll just write it. Oh yeah, but I was supposed to get E4 or something.
So my next thing is I'm going on like a computer.
My roommates and I.
Like, you get the people pictures in front of you, not so close.
I just think I'm going to
But yeah, it was supposed to get everyone together and like show everyone kind of the forward picture of my work and how it works next. Because obviously the like technical folks like didn't really know about my STS stuff, and my STS folks didn't really know about my technical work very much, and so yeah, so I was like, okay, I'm gonna show.
But something like, yes, lots of gas stations and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to your
There was a
talk.
great international studies talk yesterday by a Flemish scholar about
Okay.
what's going on in Flanders.
This is the first one.
As a result of sometimes Iran things. And it's interesting to see that different regions in Europe are affected very, very differently by
Yeah, I gave
the
a lot of
situation.
practice talks.
Well, Ireland is in a trouble with gas.
Which was definitely helpful. But like over the last, so this
I like
week
that.
and then
But
last week,
I was
2 weeks
floating a theory. So southern Italy
maybe a little too much. But it's
Southern Italy and Latvia, of all
yeah,
regions
they're all
in
doing the
Europe,
same talk.
not affected by
And I hadn't
globalization.
really.
And so I'm wondering, maybe Southern Italy is such a popular tourist destination because you don't see any Starbucks or McDonald's or
Like, now that it's at a stage where it's
Ford
like,
rent-a-cars
mature enough
when
life
you're in
where
Southern
it
Italy.
makes sense to
And
share
that's,
with
so it
people.
has its pluses and minuses.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's been good to show people what I've been doing these last 5 years or whatever. So, yeah.
I'm looking forward to catching up.
Good luck. Yeah. Good luck with the first attempt at the talk. And I think it'll be good.
We started the, so you taught at LA Unified School District for a while.
I did. Yes, I was there between undergrad and grad.
Yeah, as a science teacher.
Yeah.
What were the topics of the science and things?
So back then they had an integrated science program, so taught integrated science, physics, and robotics. Yeah.
And what was the school you taught?
Washington, it's like on Normandy and Imperial and South
Oh, okay.
Are you, do you know LA? Or?
I lived in LA for a while. Yeah.
We're in
Was
LA.
that the beach? I don't know. So I haven't really been in LA for a long time. And my son went to school there. Partly to live in Have you had school in LA?
Transitioning for a little while, but I think we're still trying to figure out where our
You had Edley as the dean, and then you know, when the dean was, yeah.
So Michelle Young, she's in her third year.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, it's hard work being a dean.
So you guys, what am I saying?
It never goes after anybody's attention. I mean, it needs to be done. You need to work with people.
in different departments, but
Oh, so graduation is only grad school.
That's what I'm vice chair for the academic senate. Senior deans of what? Deans and
Yeah.
administrators.
Well, the trouble with being a dean, of course, is you have a lot of responsibilities.
And so, you guys all are in the same.
Everything's a negotiation.
I mean, like, you guys all.
So you really
Same interests.
do something.
Okay. So what year?
I'm a second year, I'm studying computer science. You know, other people are. I'm a third year. One of the things I did is being a strike independent.
You also.
Independent.
Yes. So you guys are, I guess, computer science is, so, right now with the new school, we're kind of both.
yeah, so we're just computer science is
And then also starting a career program, learning that ahead of
Well, data science, the computer science is also.
really standing small.
yeah, that's two different majors though. ECS is in the engineering.
Yeah.
Computer science is in
That was in
Right now,
science.
because
I
you
came in
medicine.
1978.
yeah, no,
So
it's
now
in
it's-
it's
I had to leave in 84.
So
I was
computer
doing
science, data
it
science, and statistics.
Then I went back
Yeah,
to
yeah, data science.
came to
And then
the-
computer technology is going to be
and then Berkeley wanted me back. So he said they had slots for me.
Yeah, yeah, that's an.
yeah, engineering, yeah, and it's state law.
Yeah, okay.
And then I was in political science, and then eventually teaching came. And I always wanted to do ideas of how to do it.
So I started at AF Foundation. It's what
Five, four, three, two.
I mean, you know, it's, so I actually something I'm very proud of. They've been around for 5 years. So what has taken the trust to be 5 years?
Hi, everybody. Welcome. It's great to have you here today. This is another in our Human Technology Futures talks that tells you what Human Technology Futures is about. And so it's great to have you here. Today, I'm Henry Brady. I'm the former dean of the Goldman School of Public Policy. I helped start BIDS about 12 or 13 years ago, the Berkeley Institute for Data Science. So I have a long-standing interest in the intersection of computer science and the social sciences and the humanities. Today, our speaker is Thomas Phillips. His research focuses on how teachers make sense of power and hierarchy in the classroom and how they deal with that to try to get more equitable outcomes and to make the classroom a better place. He's also done stuff on the possibilities and tensions that emerge in the use of artificial intelligence. And let's face it, that's a big deal these days. I actually just spent the last hour with people from RAND Corporation talking about the future of public policy given the rise of artificial intelligence, with concerns about whether a lot of policy analysts would be out of a job because AI may do things that policy analysts have historically done. So clearly there are tensions between AI and all sorts of things, including classrooms. Thomas is a professor in the Berkeley School of Education, where he also serves as faculty director of the Berkeley Teacher Education Program. Perhaps most importantly, he once was a high school science teacher in Los Angeles, so he really knows that of which he speaks. Today he's going to talk about co-designing learning technologies with whom, for what? Thomas.
Thank you, Henry. Appreciate it. Afternoon, everyone. It's good to be here. Good to see some familiar faces, and eager to meet some of you who I haven't had a chance to meet over the last few years. Happy to be here. So my talk again is titled Co-Designing Learning Technologies for What, For Whom, and With Whom.
You're muted.
So I think I'm fine on this end. We'll take a little pause. Oh, there we go. And we'll come back to that title over the course of the talk. So oftentimes when we give talks, I think it's important to situate ourselves and remind ourselves what perspective we're coming from. So my background, I did my undergraduate here in EECS many years ago, and I loved the design elements of engineering, and was also starting to volunteer with an adult education program for the unhoused, and also fell in love with teaching and learning. So there was this push and pull between the design elements of engineering and aspects of teaching, which then got me to, as Henry was saying, become a high school teacher in Los Angeles. So taught high school science. It was back when they had integrated science, also taught physics and robotics in a public high school in South LA. At that point, though, I was thinking about a lot of questions around teaching and learning, and I decided to come back to Cal for my graduate work. So I'm Cal Bear through and through, keep on coming back. And so my advisor at the time for my PhD was actually a physicist who thought about how people form concepts as they learn physics. And what was unique about his position at the time was that oftentimes when students don't understand something, there's a tendency to name that as a misconception. But from the perspective of Andy, who's my advisor, Andy built on this notion that these are actually all intuitive understandings that then become really valuable in when we form conceptual understandings in physics. So it's kind of thinking about those intuitive understandings and building on those strengths. Can go into that discussion at some other point if anyone is interested. But what also happened was it took a lot of courses in Soc and rhetoric and became interested in questions around ideology, and saw this interesting parallel between the ways in which folks in the social sciences and humanities were thinking about ideology, helps us understand the larger socio-political context, but often not of how individuals make sense of it. On the flip side, the field that I'm a part of, the learning sciences, really helped me understand how people form concepts, especially in physics in science and mathematics, but didn't address some of these socio-political issues. So part of my doctoral work was putting these concepts or frameworks together to think about how people form ideas of the world around them. So from there, went to UCLA. I was a faculty member there for 10 years, and then came back to Cal in 2018, professor of education, but also the faculty director of our teacher education program. Also want to just mention a little bit about the field that I belong to, the learning sciences. This is actually a relatively new field that coalesced in the 1990s. It was a lot of faculty, especially here at Berkeley, Northwestern, Vanderbilt, and Stanford, that came together to form this field. And largely, these were folks who were educational psychologists, right? And so educational psychologists oftentimes relied on lab tests or lab studies, right? So you'd have cognitive studies in the laboratory context. And what was oftentimes apparent, though, is you would run these amazing lab studies. You would get a understanding of how students make sense of concepts. But then you go into a classroom, and things look wildly different, right? So you've got this kid here who's yawning. You've got this other kid who's immersed in his book and not paying attention to anything else, and you're not quite sure what's going on with these other three children. But that's one of the challenges, right? We can have lab studies that produce these beautiful results, but when we put them in a real-world context, things might look a little different. So the shift in the learning sciences was to study learning in its real-world contexts. So with that, what I want to do today is talk through a retrospective on two NSF-funded interdisciplinary collaborations that I was a part of. So the first is a project, a funded project that I was a co-PI on when I was at UCLA. It's called Mobilize, which ran between 2010 and 2015. And a project called ISAT, which is CU Boulder is a lead institution. I'm also senior personnel on that, and we just got a renewal on which I'm a co-PI. But I wanted to talk through these two different collaborations and what they might offer us as we think about educational technologies. So again, Mobilize was a $12 million five-year grant, and it was really focused on developing a high school introduction to data science course. And it was also leveraging using mobile devices to allow students to collect and analyze data relevant to their own interests. So again, let's make sure we go back about, 15, 16 years in time. As I was looking back at this, this project, it reminded me of how much things have changed over the course of this period. But again, this was a time where, this was the closest picture of a smartphone that I could find from that time. But it was also, I was reminded that most high school students they weren't carrying around mobile phones like they did now. And most of them didn't use like these, what we're seeing as these touchscreen smartphones at the time. But the project was driven by this idea that real-world, out-of-classroom data collection could be a powerful motivator for learning. And we know that working with real data, being able to engage in the whole process of data collection, refining it, and then analyzing it is also incredibly powerful. So the project was very much driven by this premise. But what I want to bring out is part of the challenge was that much of this work was also driven by assumptions of interest and use. Right? So there was an idea that students would be incredibly excited to use these mobile technologies, to have these tools, to go about the world, the community, and collect data and then analyze them. And what was actually helpful to understand too is there was a lot of initial validation by students and teachers. So you ask a student, hey, do you want a brand new phone where you can analyze data and do this? There's a lot of affirmation saying, absolutely, we want to do this. Teachers were very much along the lines that this will change everything in the school context because it'll empower them as learners. This is going to really change the context. Many of us who were on the educational side expressed concerns about what does this mean to think about it, put so much value in a tool. But the project proceeded, and needless to say, after a little while, the novelty effect wore off. Right? There was an initial novelty effect. Students wanted to go explore, use this tool, but things only last. The novelty only lasts so long, and so what we saw was a tapering down of this novelty. But I think more importantly, and what I thought fascinating was students started to say, this isn't a phone. Right? This is a device for school. Right? And because part of it is the phone was stripped of a lot of its social capabilities, of the capabilities to interact with each other, to communicate. Everything that made it a phone was stripped away and it became a data collection tool. And for them, there was like, this doesn't interest me. So we'd see these phones in their Ziploc bags, tucked away in their backpacks, and all the hype around what this was supposed to do never played out. So again, I'm glossing over a lot of the details, but if anyone's interested, these are a few pieces that came out of this work. The first was a framework that a colleague and I, grad student at the time, colleague at Stanford now, we started thinking about how do we look past the allure of digital technologies in classrooms and think about their real affordances. So we proposed this framework of thinking about the texts, the tools, and the talk that's afforded by a tool or by a technology. So if we're thinking about the text, the tools, and the talk, it takes away the allure, and we can have an candid conversation about its actual affordances. And the second piece looks at this transition of going from a phone to a device for school. So I want to touch a little bit on how this played out as well. So one curricular project was students being asked to keep track of their snacking habits and to then analyze their snacking habits and what that, through an analysis of your snacking habits, understand the larger context, what you might do to change yourselves. Again, much of this work was done in LA Unified, largely Latino, and to a smaller extent, African-American students. One of the challenges here is they were collecting a lot of data about their own eating habits, and without a social critique, without a critique of the larger political context, or even a knowledge of food deserts and the larger economics that affords access or denies access to healthy foods, much of this then became a deficit understanding of their own families and their own communities. So we also saw this challenge, right, that we were inviting them into talking about data, analyzing data, but without a socio-political critique, oftentimes this ended up having adverse effects and essentially leading to these deficit understandings of themselves. I'm going to just show one more example of this, and this was a piece that colleagues and I have written about, but it was also using other digital tools. So the New York Times, if you remember, in the early 2010s, had these amazing data visualizations. One was about Netflix data rental patterns. And this was back when Netflix used to actually mail you the DVDs. And so you could look up popularity of different movies in different regions. And this was, again, just a data visualization that was represented. It was supposed to be a quick conversation in the classroom. But as you can see, this is a largely, it's a black film, black director, producer, actors. And it was rented in primarily the historically African-American neighborhoods in the Los Angeles area. This was presented, and one of the students in class ended up shouting out "ghetto," and so it immediately racializes this data visualization. And we know this happens because any map in the United States is a representation of racial histories as well. Like when we think about redlining and when we think about the histories of segregation. Two African-American students in there, brilliant with data analysis, made a strong argument for why this is a representation of racial solidarity. The teacher didn't want to enter that conversation, so tried to make an argument that it was about marketing. So again, we see this contestation over the meaning of this data visualization in a way in which the data and the representations were actually really rich in bringing up real-world questions and problems, but without an adequate way to complicate that and think about how multiple perspectives could enrich that understanding, we ended up in a place where it actually was not particularly productive from either learning about data or learning about the larger sociopolitical context. So I glossed over a lot of this, but what I want to do is I want to propose a post-mortem of this collaboration that I had. So part of it is when we think about team membership, it was actually a pretty pretty robust team. There were computer scientists, there were statisticians, there were educational researchers, there were coaches, there were teachers. So we had a really powerful team of people come together. But when we think about the orientation or the problem to be solved, the orientation was essentially that we have these new edges in the field of data science, especially in higher education. We have these tools that are allowing us to do incredibly powerful investigations. How might we bring that into a K-12 context? And so the orientation was that we have something working here. How do we move it over here? So in the conceptualization of expertise, the expertise was essentially that of the data scientist and the computer scientist. There was translational work that others had to do, but the valued expertise was that of computer scientists and data scientists. So the structures for collaboration and co-learning were oftentimes that we need to learn about data science as opposed to understanding school ecologies or classroom pedagogies. And then similarly, the question around engagement with users is that there was user feedback. You would talk to students a little bit, you would get some feedback from them, but the overall direction of the project was largely determined already. There's very few places from where you could deviate from that. So I'm going to come back to the same sort of postmortem with another project that I'm working on, but I want us to think about what constitutes collaboration or interdisciplinary collaboration across expertise that especially exists at a university context. So I want to pivot to ISAT, and this is was the first AI institute that was funded by the NSF in education. It's about 9 universities involved. Again, as I said, CU Boulder is the lead institution. This ran from 2020 to 2025, and we just got a renewal for the next 5 years. And this project was really focused on developing AI partners to support student collaboration in classrooms. So again, thinking about if you have AI partners, how might they support especially small group conversations, collaboration among students? I also want to highlight my collaborator on this work. So Michael worked with me really closely on the work that I'm going to be describing today. But I also want to just highlight some parts of Michael's background to show the value of people who can cross some boundaries. So Michael actually finished up his Ph.D. in computer science here at Cal. So he received his Ph.D. in 2021. Towards the end of his Ph.D., he started taking classes in education because he got intrigued with questions around education. So he took a couple of courses with me and my colleagues. And so when this opportunity came with ISAT, and there was an opportunity to hire a postdoc, hired Michael. And so he worked with me on this project for about 3 years. But I found Michael an incredibly valuable boundary crosser in this space of moving between different forms of expertise and being able to translate across fields that oftentimes aren't used to talking to each other. So currently he's an assistant professor of education and also a faculty fellow in the computing and data science division at Boston University. So again, our idea with this larger project was to develop AI partners to support classroom collaboration. And as we were thinking about collaboration, again, we saw the same dynamic that was starting to emerge in Mobilize, where there were assumptions about what would work. And part of those assumptions were, if we could just keep students on track and keep them from getting off track, collaboration would proceed, right? So it's a sense that on-task and off-task behaviors are really important to pay attention to. And again, there was a lot of initial validation from students as well as teachers. So especially when you ask teachers, they're like, of course you want your students to stay on task, right? When you're working in a small group, you're over here, that group's over there. how can I keep them on task? This would be great. So we get a lot of initial feedback from our partners or from teachers and students about taking this approach. What I did value about ISAT as a larger collaboration is that we had a collective commitment to the responsible innovation framework. And part of that was really thinking about the cycle of anticipation, thinking about what you use, what might be some of the effects of an innovation, thinking about reflexivity, right? How do you create structures for your project to be self-critical, thinking about inclusion of who's at the table when we have these conversations, and responsiveness, right? That we have to be able to be nimble and adaptable before we lock into, again, contrasting that with Mobilize, they had committed to a certain strategy and there was very limited responsiveness built into it. Part of this was we decided to run what we called learning futures workshops. So these were spaces where we brought in students, teachers, and other community members to think about what are some of your hopes, fears, and dreams, especially around AI. Right? And once we get to understand some of the hopes, fears, and dreams, how might we be nimble enough to adapt to that space? So I want to just lead you, again, relatively quickly through a couple of the learning future workshops. So the first one, this was during COVID, so it was online, but we had primarily students from Oakland and Denver, at about 20 students. And on days 1 and 2, we really thought about building up a socio-technical critique or a socio-technical understanding. And so what was really powerful to hear was to hear these young people, all high school-age students, with insightful critiques of data privacy, bias, impact, especially when they were considering AI applications outside of the school context. So especially when they're thinking about social media, and other applications. So it was really powerful to see how much knowledge they already had coming into this space, right? So a lot of the critiques that we would want them to be able to navigate, they had pretty powerful understandings of those. On day 3, and again, what was beautiful about these learning futures workshops is that we had extended time with them. Right? We oftentimes had 4 to 5 full days with them, which allowed us to work through ideas as opposed to an initial user feedback. And so on day 3, we asked them to start envisioning AI to support collaboration in the classrooms. What did they come up with? On task, off task. And they said, we want a tool that's going to keep students on task. And so this conversation goes on for about 15, 20 minutes. And at some point, I just pause and I ask them, so I just want to pause this all here, and I just want to make sure I'm understanding all of you correctly. So if you have an AI partner at your table and you go off task, you're perfectly fine if this AI partner intervenes and tells you to get back on track, right? And they're like, hell no, we throw that out the window. And then what really emerged from there is that they were designing for the other, right? So they weren't designing these tools for themselves, but they were designing for the other. And part of designing for the other, then what we see is it actually reifies a lot of the hierarchies that exist already in school, right? So there was a sense of who are the smart kids, who isn't smart, which kids are motivated, which kids are not. So they were actually designing these AI tools that would have actually reinscribed a lot of the existing inequitable hierarchies as opposed to trying to challenge them. That was really helpful for us to see about this process and what sort of imagination exists to create these AI tools that might actually help us think differently, act differently. So with the Learning Futures Workshop number 2, Michael and I were thinking about how might we create another experience for students to experience collaboration differently. And part of that is that our connotations around collaboration are relatively limited. So we were thinking about how can we allow for a different imagination of collaboration. So Michael was living in one of the graduate student co-ops at the time, and so many of you are probably familiar with the co-ops. So we decided that we were going to take them to a co-op and help them understand what collaboration looked like. And for me, like I lived in the co-ops when I was an undergrad and grad student here too. So this is a picture. Most of those are students. Michael's right there in purple. In addition to the overall guy who became very well known in most of our conversations. What was really powerful about this space is that they started seeing how there's a 70% graduate student co-op, and it blew their mind that this co-op could run itself without anyone explicitly in charge, right? And so for a lot of these students, for these young people, there was a sense that we're so used to hierarchical systems that it was the first time that they were experiencing a space where people could self-organize. And it was a different model, right? And so a lot of their questions initially were just very mundane around how do you share Wi-Fi, how do you deal with bathrooms and showers and all of that. But then it really came to like, what if there's conflict? What if there's a problem? And they're so used to having a teacher or an administrator step in or police step in if it's an out-of-school context. But what they really began to understand was this idea that there's a community builder and there are ways of resolving issues within a cooperative space. And again, one of the interviewed house members said, at the end of the day, this is your house. So really thinking about ownership of your space. This became an instrumental point because it really allowed for people to see there are different ways of being, right? And oftentimes when we design, we're designing from our experience. So how can we design from a different experience that is more collaborative? And so when we got back to Berkeley Way West, the next activity was to have people design a collaborative, potential collaborative AI partner. And so this collaborative AI partner that they came up with is what they called Live, Love, Light. And it was, and you can see their mock-up right there. But essentially, it's like if you're hanging out as, they said, because part of what they started thinking about is if we want a collaboration, we want a place for people to come and be together and socialize. But then there was this question, if they're there and they socialize, what if someone does something to someone else that makes them uncomfortable or hurts them in some form? Like, how are we going to make sure that this stays a place that everyone can thrive and flourish? So one of the first ideas that came up was like some sort of policing mechanism. But again, then the students started to think about like, is that what we want? Do we want someone that from the outside to police us, or do we want it to emerge from within? And so they came up with this system that if there's like curse words that said this red light will light up, it allows students to reflect and think about what's happening within their space, if there's slurs, loud volume, et cetera. So they started dreaming up this space of this tool of how might we create a space where we belong and where we support each other, but we're not policing each other. What I appreciated about ISAT was when we took this back to the larger team, and again, the larger team includes computer scientists, people who focus on human-computer interaction. So it's a very interdisciplinary team. There's over 100 people in there. But people were willing to run with this idea. So I'm gonna, sorry. So I'm gonna just briefly show a video of a tool called Kobe, which is short for Community Builder, that was built on this live, love, light, right? And to think about how this idea then became a tool that ISAT worked on.
In today's world, collaboration and teamworking skills are more important than ever. Whether you dream of becoming a scientist, an athlete, or musician, being able to collaborate effectively with others is key to achieving success. Collaboration means being able to get along with others when you work towards a common goal. It's about behaving in a way that brings out the best in everyone. Our team has spoken with many students about how technology could help make learning more engaging and fun. One idea that students had was to use technology for community building. So we created COBE, which stands for Community Builder. It uses microphones for speech recognition and language understanding to give feedback on how you and your peers can build community. COBE is rooted in the idea of community agreements. These are the rules that you believe should guide your small group projects in class. COBE can recognize 4 main agreement categories: respect, community, equity, and thinking. In order to use COBE, you first establish a list of agreements in each category. For equity, you might agree to give everyone the chance to contribute in their own way. But could it also be an example for respect? This is up to you to decide. Put the same agreement into more than one category if it makes sense to you. Anything that you think will help you create an atmosphere where everyone's unique perspectives and contributions are valued and celebrated. While you're working in small groups, COBE will analyze your conversations to recognize moments when you and your peers express one of your community agreements. And when you're done with the activity, you can review together as a class what COBE has noticed. Of course, your comfort and privacy are really important, and having a computer listen to you can feel intrusive. But COBE only listens to you if you give it permission, and you can always opt out from participating. Your personal information is always protected. Not only that, but as part of its design, COBE can only give feedback to the whole class and not to each student individually. Also, COBE will not get things right every time, but just by using it in class, you can help us in making it better and better over time. Remember, collaboration and teamworking are important skills to have when you're in school, when you're out of school, later in your career, and overall in life. COBE is designed to make collaborations in the classroom more fun and effective, and to help you grow these skills over time.
And so just to give you a sense of what COBE does is it listens in for these agreements, and as it potentially sees a class or someone in the class, say, moving forward with thinking, it grows a red flower, right? And so it starts off just as a tree. And so we thought a lot about what the representation might look like. But it's when these different agreements are fulfilled in a classroom context, it grows the flowers, and students can see that in real time or afterwards. So when I think about the power of COBE, what I want to stress, it's not in the tool per se, right? Because I don't think the use of the tool itself is what's going to lead to collaboration. And I want to be clear about that. But it's actually this process of actually developing agreements that's incredibly powerful. This can be done even without the tool. But the process of developing these agreements is proved incredibly powerful. Also, what we see is reflecting on how well they met their agreements based on COBE's representation, but then on reflecting how well COBE represented their reflections, which isn't always necessarily the case, right? And it's interesting that they also tend to game it and see what happens, right? All right, saying over and over again, Catherine, really, really appreciate what you just said. Really appreciate it. And they can see that, but I think that's part of the power as well, right? Because then they see the affordances, limitations, and risks of AI, right? And so they're actually working with this tool, and they're seeing how it interprets what they say and they do. But it also allows for this critical analysis of the tool itself. And finally, what we're starting to work on is trying to get under the hood. And how do you start to see the underlying code, how COBE works, and how you might make sense of that. Again, I think it's a helpful way for them to engage with what we oftentimes refer to as AI literacies. But not thinking about AI literacies in the abstract, but to see how an AI partner situated within a classroom space is performing relative to their understandings and their hopes. And again, if folks are interested in actually the analysis that we did with the Learning Features Workshop, it's a piece that we've published a couple of years, last year, I guess. So again, if I want to move to a postmortem of ISAT, again, similar to Mobilize, I think what was really powerful is it was a very interdisciplinary team. had people from multiple disciplines, had coaches, teachers, students involved. But in terms of the orientation or the problem to be solved, I think what was different here is there was a shared goal of thinking about collaboration in classrooms. It was an open-ended problem that none of us knew how to solve, right? And so there was a shared commitment that we all have some expertise to solve this problem, or even to begin to address it. I think solve might be overly ambitious. But all of our perspectives were very partial. And I think there was an understanding that we had partial expertise, that coming together, there was a possibility of building something that was greater than each of our areas of expertise. And this goes back to this idea of conceptualization of expertise as being complementary and needing to work together and needing to learn from other fields. We built in a number of structures for collaboration and co-learning. So initially we had with our whole group, with our whole team of again, nearly 100 people, we had multiple retreats. And part of those retreats were so strand 1 were largely the natural language processing folks. Strand 2 was the human-computer interaction folks. Strand 3 were the educational researchers. But each of us would share and come to an understanding of the work that we're doing. And so other teams could also learn about the perspectives that the other strands are bringing in. So there's real built-in structures for collaboration and co-learning. And then finally, when it comes to engagement with users, there was this commitment to co-design or participatory design, right? That we're not just going to do a one-time short user feedback, because those are limited. And when we oftentimes think about those short interactions, they tend to reproduce existing assumptions. But if people are given time to think through the complexities, we can also start to envision new possibilities. So I'd like to also put these 2 projects into a larger history of ed tech as I begin to close up. I've always found this book by Larry Cuban. He's a retired professor from Stanford. But his work I find really compelling because he looks at the history of multiple technologies. And so when, say, film came out, and this was in the 1920s, there was a sense that we have solved the educational issue because all we need to do is film the best teacher out there, and then we can mass produce this teacher, right? And so why do we need hundreds upon hundreds of teachers? We just need this one brilliant teacher. It sounds a little bit like MOOCs in 2010, but we see these processes play out. And where television came out, it was the same sort of discourse. And these aren't just abstract ideas. There was a decade in which students in American Samoa were taught sitting in front of televisions with curriculum being broadcast from mainland United States. So these experiments were tried, but all of these came with a promise that this is going to dramatically change education. And then we see, for those of you familiar with B.F. Skinner, he's a behaviorist. Skinner, and Audrey Waters writes about this beautifully. Skinner in the 1950s and 60s created what he called the teaching machine. And it was this idea that students would sit at these teaching machines and do work that's most relevant to them. And so the discourse is so much like we hear about personalized learning today. Right? It's almost a perfect match between personalized learning and Skinner's teaching machines from the 50s and 60s. And when we think about the role of AI, I find this cover from Popular Mechanics in 1961 very helpful to think back about too, right? Will robots teach our children? And so we have this discourse over and over again that technologies are going to revolutionize education. And yet, over and over again, we see them fall short. But I do want to acknowledge the particularity of AI and ed tech. It's different now with all these factors, but also the amount of resources and financial resources that major technological corporations are pouring into educational technology. So again, the questions we might ask as we design technologies that address complex social problems. I want to go back to this piece that I co-authored with a few of my colleagues, but really thinking about not just the how of what we design, but asking these questions: for what? For what purpose? What's the social purpose? For whom and with whom? And these are questions, if we think about designing educational technologies, how might we commit to thinking about forms of participatory design or co-design when appropriate? I just want to close with what I think about some of the unique possibilities of HTF in light of my thinking back about these two different projects. And first is really thinking about synergies. And the first part of that is what it takes to address society's most pressing issues. And part of that comes with humility, that we are all addressing major problems, major questions for which all of us have some form of expertise, but expertise that oftentimes is insufficient. Right? And what I've learned from my colleagues, especially in ISAT, who bring in other technical expertise, but also human-computer interaction expertise, has been profound. And I really value that space of learning from each other. And for us to actually tackle these issues, we need that complementary expertise, but some humility that comes with that as well. And the structures that allow for co-learning. I'm also thinking about individual versus institutional approaches. So again, all of us can find some good colleagues and do this work one-on-one or in small groups or in large projects. But I do wonder what the possibilities of a place like Berkeley might be for us to really intentionally think about what co-learning might look like across disciplines, and for us to create a space where we are thinking about technology and data to address some of the most pressing problems, but in a way that builds on the collective expertise of our campus. And then I'm coming back to thinking about Michael, my collaborator, Michael Chang, but the possibility of pushing disciplinary edges of fields or multiple fields, particularly through students and postdocs, right? The work that students have always found, what I loved about Berkeley as a student was the ability to move between, say, education and social sciences and rhetoric, and to have that space of building something that didn't exist otherwise. And what I love working with students now is the connections that they make when they take courses and when they move across campus is things that go beyond any of our individual perspectives. So I really hope that this is also a possibility for us to think about supporting students and postdocs to do creative work that we need as a society at this moment, but transcends our individual expertise. So thank you all.
So we have time for questions, and I'm going to pass the mic around. We'll be able to run up until 4 o'clock and a little later if folks want. So you have the first question.
Hello, thank you for your talk. My name is Trinity, part of PCS. And I was just a bit curious on COBE and how it interacted with the students. I was really fascinated by the way the students were confused at the lack of a hierarchical structure in a co-op. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if COBE may have existed to fill that, to become that kind of hierarchical structure within a non-hierarchical setting, like a group work, because like in groups, there's no typical leader, especially at school. Mm-hmm. So was COBE kind of filling that? And additionally, how did COBE affect concerns over the over-reliance on tools in education?
Yeah, those are great questions, Trinity. So we've been thinking a lot about structures within cooperative groups. So there's, I think about the work of my colleague at Stanford, Jenny Asuna, who studies group dynamics. And so there's actually, while we might not think about groups being particularly hierarchical, there's actually a lot of power dynamics that work in a small group discussion, right? There are senses of perceived smartness, ability, who's more vocal. And so these dynamics actually play out quite substantially. And small groups that aren't well structured tend to reproduce a lot of these hierarchies. So part of it is understanding like the challenges that exist within small group spaces. And so with something like COBE, it also provided whole class representations and not individual groups or students. So they could reflect as a class what they were doing. But as you're saying, I think there's a possibility of this reliance. And but I think what we've seen in the way it plays out is students are not pointing to it as a way of this is, again, because it's class level data or representations rather than small group representations. It prompts reflection and conversation rather than kind of finger pointing or a sense that we did well or we didn't, right? Because you don't know how your group performed in relationship to, at least according to COBE, to the larger class. But as I was saying, we struggle with this too. We see this as a first step. A successful class, we would, like at least our position is that in a successful class, COBE would get phased out. Right? Because it's the idea that COBE gets introduced to get people to think about these questions, to reflect on it. But if it's actually successful, if it's actually effective in doing what it should be doing, it should get phased out. As opposed to, I think AI tools oftentimes where we're leaning towards that reliance as opposed to intentional phasing out. Did you have a second question?
No, that was really insightful. Thank you so much.
Hi, Thomas. Thanks so much. It was a great talk. I was curious if you could share a little bit more about how you went from the Live, Laugh, Light to COBE, and was there kind of a process of bringing the students along in that? So was there more of the co-design and like the tool development as well? And any thoughts you have and reflections you have around like co-design, I guess, both opportunities and limitations in terms of how far you can bring participants sometimes along even in like the technology design process. So any reflections on that? And then just relatedly, how is the next stage, curious how you're thinking about the next stage of the project now, especially we're in such a different period than we were in 2020 with AI, and there's so much hype around generative AI and learning, and any just reflections on what's next?
Yeah, so that process of, from Live, Light, Love, there was a sense of presenting different possibilities. And on our part, the co-design team was like, we were excited about it. And we appreciated what they brought out. And we essentially said, we'll take it back to the larger team and we'll see where it goes. And because again, it's a large team, and but it resonated a lot with the larger team, and it became a part of that design process. Fortunately, we have this long-term relationship with most of the student participants. Many of them are students in Oakland, and so we could actually engage with them on an ongoing basis. And remember, like, showing the prototype of it to one of the students, and Michael was doing a third Learning Features workshop the next year, and this particular student who was a part of raising this idea, like, he shared it, and he's like, wow, you all just actually built that? And I think for them that was incredibly powerful too, because usually we ask students to do these exercises, and then either they go in a publication in the best case scenario, but they rarely make it to the next stage. So that was incredibly helpful for them, or affirming for them to see that their ideas were valued and they were taken up. What we're continuing to do now is a series of workshops with students and teachers to see how this is actually playing out in the classroom contexts, what's working for them, what's limited. We are, as we start to think about the next phase, and this is just one of the handful of tools that were developed, so focused on COBE here, but there are other tools that are coming out of the Institute as well. Where we're at now is one, continuing to develop some of these tools, but I'm also working with in the spirit of a Learning Futures workshop, we're actually working with a number of the district leaders who make decisions about AI tools and leading them in a Learning Futures workshop. And what's been really powerful about that, what's been really powerful about that is I think many of them feel that technology happens to them, right? That there's a technology that's adopted, and then teachers are forced to use it. So part of what we're trying to develop is a set of questions thinking about the pedagogical value of these tools, right? And really having them discern, what does this afford, either socially or pedagogically? What questions should we be asking? And how can we make sure that these tools are adopted on the terms of educators rather than by others, right? And I think so often schools, it's adopted at a district level where the rationale for adopting is either fear of like test scores dropping, and so they promise increased test scores, or there's compliance issues, right? And so you want to ensure some sort of monitoring of digital spaces, so you end up adopting AI tools that surveil students' documents in the background. And so you see a number of these tools coming up, primarily because to meet these goals rather than teachers' thoughtful pedagogical choices around AI.
I'm going to do a brief pause, and then, because Siona has a short announcement, and then we'll go to, we had two questions back there.
Hi, I'm Siona. I'm the president of Political Computer Science, which is an undergraduate organization that supports human technology futures. We're holding a series of faculty lightning talks next Tuesday in Evans 60 from 3:30 to 5. Professor Carson will be giving a speech along with 4 other faculty in various departments, including EECS, political science, philosophy, etc. I know this room is really interested in listening to people's research, and I thought it would be an excellent way to sort of get people to attend. So if you're interested, stop by me on your way out, and I will give you the QR code to sign up. Thank you for...
Thank you so much, Siona. The student initiative in this area is really heartening. So,
Sure. Hi, I think my name is Paul. I work for Johns Hopkins University. I study agency and these gaps between opportunity and action. You're talking about affordances. I assume you mean like the technological affordances, similar to like what a smartphone connected to the internet affords and what a teacher actually does with that. Is that the sort of question or gap that you're trying to look at with what these could afford in classrooms? And what do you think the like leading hypotheses or research questions are to figure out or encourage teachers to get the most out of what technology affords?
Tell me if I'm going down a different direction than what your question is asking. So I'm, as an educator, and especially as a teacher educator, I think part of what we oftentimes overlook is how context dependent and responsive teaching and learning is and should be, right? So when we think about affordances, I think oftentimes what happens with educational technologies is there's a rather abstracted view of what this tool can do, right? And these, so it can support students in learning particular content, or there's promises around efficiency, as opposed to kind of going back to the frame that I briefly mentioned that Antero and I had thought about is, instead, if we think about tool ed tech as what sort of texts do they actually create or make available? What sort of talk do they make available? And what sort of tools do they afford? That allows us then to have a more critical conversation about, in this particular context, in a classroom context, what are the new how does this support teaching and learning in new ways? So like even if we think about, it's a trivial example, right? But if we think about, say, Google Docs, and people like Cuban have written about this extensively, but if we think about Google Docs as telling students, type up your essay, it actually doesn't, it doesn't provide any real affordance over paper and pencil writing, right? They're essentially the same thing. At most in an elementary classroom, it just adds a lot of burden. If you've ever been in an elementary classroom, ask kids to take out the Chromebooks, log in, and by the time is over, some kids are just logging in, so it actually has disadvantages there. But if you think about Google Docs as a form of like the comment features, like it allows a new form of talk that hasn't existed in many periods of human experience, right? The way in which we can engage with each other's texts and comment and have a particular type of talk that didn't exist before is a new affordance, which allows for a new type of learning that wouldn't have happened otherwise. So again, a very trivial, taken for granted tool, but if it's used in Model 1, which is just about typing it up, it has no real learning affordance. While in this, if you intentionally think about it as creating a multi-party, oftentimes asynchronous dialogue, it has these powerful new learning opportunities. Does that get to where?
Yeah, I was curious if you, because people talk about psychological affordance. Psychological affordances also, which in your belonging uses of the tools, they're psychologically affording people to participate, feel respected. So like I was kind of, affordance is a term, it's a fun one, but it gets like thrown around in a bunch of different ways. And, I could also see it being, like you're describing now, affording, or in some of these, affording, greater participation by people that they feel like they can use it. Yeah, I don't know.
Right, and I think you also, your point is really well taken, right? It's with COBE, the affordances are really about also creating space for people to think about their own interactions with each other. And so it's an affordance around belonging, communication, group work, cooperation.
Hey, that was a great talk. Thanks so much. I have a question that I've been thinking about, and I would love for you to speak to it, which is, as someone designing these technologies in the classroom, and I've been trying to do this as well, the big question that always comes up is how do you know that how do you evaluate? And especially as ed tech is pushing technologies, what kind of framework should we be setting up? I mean, ideally, we know RCTs are the gold standard, but it seems that no one ever runs RCTs because they're so hard to run. So how would you know if COBE, we can look at things at what COBE does, but how do we know that it's actually helping students become better collaborators 20 years down the line, right? And so can you speak to what maybe we should be doing about this as a community?
Again, I think there are multiple answers to that. And in the spirit of what I was saying about some sort of epistemological and methodological humility, that's a question that I think needs multiple people to engage with and think about. So I can speak about it from my own perspective. So I'm a qualitative researcher, and I spend hours in classrooms. So in any of these studies, it meant hours and hours in classrooms thinking about interaction. And part of that, like thinking about those interactions, is paying attention to even discourse, right? So oftentimes, if you think about discourse from an interactional perspective or improvisational perspective, something that I utter right now, and it's artificial here because in the context, but especially if we're on a small group conversation, whatever I utter only takes its full meaning when someone else responds, right? So I think there's a sense that we speak and there's an explicit meaning to that. But human interaction is so complex that whatever I say will only take its full meaning when the other person responds. And so to study that, and so I think one of the challenges with a lot of the large-scale studies is looking at excerpted utterances without understanding that human dynamic of meaning making. So for me, like studying Kobe would require in-depth, high-touch, qualitative analyses of how young people make sense of each other, their collective meaning making, and how Kobe either supports that or limits that in some fashion. And I think those studies, coupled with RCTs or others, give us a fuller sense. But I think it really comes back to this question of what do we mean by things working? And I think a lot of the studies that focus on, take a large-scale RCT approach, doesn't attend to the human aspect of learning, right? So it's this question of what are we measuring? And I think there are definitely affordances of such studies, and we also miss out on what are those interactional dynamics, how people are making sense of collaboration in the moment. And that to me seems just as important as knowing whether they're going to collaborate differently 20 years from now. I know I'm not getting, yeah.
I'm definitely not trying to make a distinction between quantitative versus qualitative methods or research. Like, I guess what I'm trying to understand is when we make the choice to introduce a technology, it's difficult to even understand all of the repercussions of that technology. For example, is it right for an AI to be judging humans on whether they're like being empathetic? Like that question itself seems like a question whether I don't know the right answer to that. I don't know the right answer to that question. And so in a world where we're always under budget cuts, especially in education, there's going to be choices of how to make. And I'm really interested in thinking about how we can, like your title is just so compelling, right? It feels like we should be understanding what the trade-off space is. And I don't know how to understand it, and I would love to figure this out. So I don't. So if my question came across as trying to make a case for RCTs, that was not what I was trying to do. That's all I wanted to really say. But I have to run, unfortunately. Thank you. But thank you for a great talk.
If folks need to go, please do feel free, and anyone who wants to stay and continue the conversation. I think probably we should wrap up the questions now because it looks like a good group is heading out. So once again, thank you to Thomas Phillip for giving us this wonderful talk, and thank you for coming to the HDF Colloquium Series.